I was scrolling through social media the other day when I came across a line that stopped me mid-thumb flick. Believing value alone is enough to reach people is arrogance. It's a sharp thought, isn't it? The idea that you can have the best product in the world, but if you can't communicate that worth, you have nothing. I decided to jump into the comments with what I thought was a perfect supporting analogy. I wrote, exactly. Think of all the restaurants with genuinely incredible food that go out of business simply because that quality never actually reached the customers. I expected a nod or a conversation about marketing. Instead, the first reply I got was, I wonder if they could have just raised their prices. I stared at the screen for a second, genuinely floored. I was talking about the failure of communication, the bridge between the kitchen and the street, and they were talking about a menu pricing strategy. We were both typing in the same language. We both understood the word restaurant, but it was as if we were standing on two different planets, shouting into a void. I started noticing this pattern everywhere. It's like the person who walks into a shop at 8 p.m. holding a coupon that clearly states first 3 customers only, and when you tell them the slots are gone, they look at you with total unblinking confusion and ask, so I can't use it. They can read the words first 3. They know it's nighttime, but those two facts simply refuse to shake hands in their brain. It's not a matter of literacy. Most of these people have perfectly fine educations. It's something much stranger. The gap between recognizing a word and following its meaning to a logical conclusion. As I look closer, I realize this breakdown isn't just a random glitch. It happens across 4 very specific levels of comprehension. And the most unsettling part, most of us are trapped in at least one of these levels without ever realizing the wall is even there.
Yeah, that invisible wall is, it's honestly fascinating. Because that space between just recognizing information and actually internalizing the logic behind it, that's the foundation of almost every single communication failure we experience.
Right. They're mapping out exactly why that happens is the whole mission of our deep dive today.
Exactly. I mean, we operate under this assumption that a shared vocabulary guarantees a shared reality.
But it totally doesn't, right?
The mechanics of the brain completely dictate otherwise. The process of moving from reading something to understanding it and then actually applying it to your behavior is, it's full of very specific identifiable failure points.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah.
Because we assume if you're smart, if you have the expertise, you're immune to this stuff. But you brought some sources today that completely dismantle that idea.
Absolutely. The research we're diving into shows that expertise basically offers zero protection against irrationality. We're going to break down how the brain processes, fails to process information across different contexts and emotional states.
Okay, so where do we even start with this? You mentioned 4 specific levels of comprehension breakdowns.
Yeah. So the best place to start mapping this failure is right at the top, the level of application. Because here, the breakdown isn't a lack of intelligence. It's actually a localized suppression of it.
A localized suppression, meaning what exactly?
Meaning your brain literally turns off its own logic in very specific situations. Let me give you a physical example to kind of ground this.
Yes.
Picture a quiet, recessed corner of a really high-end bistro in London. The ambiance is totally meticulous. The air smells like reduced red wine and roasted garlic.
Amazing.
Right. The dining room is mostly empty, the lighting is soft, and it's exactly 6:02 p.m. And sitting alone at a corner table is Dr. Julian Eris.
Okay, and Julian is our expert, right?
Julian is not someone you'd ever expect to struggle with logic. He's this renowned organizational psychologist. He literally wrote the definitive textbook on the logic of operational boundaries.
So his whole career is basically built on rigorous logical systems.
Exactly. Just that morning, he was sitting in the sterile, glass-walled boardroom, coaching a prominent CEO. The CEO was dealing with operational chaos because they kept making exceptions for certain clients.
The classic just this once problem.
And Julian was surgical in his advice. He diagrammed why you have to stick to preset systems. He explained that flexibility, if it doesn't have structural discipline, it just destroys the company's integrity.
Which is perfectly logical.
Flawless reasoning. Right. He could see the structural reality of the business from a perfect objective distance. But then, fast forward to 6:02 p.m. in the bistro.
The moment of truth, Vince.
Well, Julian has been traveling, he's exhausted, his blood sugar is low, and he just wants to order from the early bird special menu.
Which I'm guessing based on the time just ended.
Exactly. The perfectly polite waiter approaches the table and explains that the early bird pricing strictly ends at 6:00 p.m. And the rule is printed clearly on a brass plaque at the host stand, and right at the top of the menu Julian is holding.
So zero ambiguity. The rule is right there.
None. But this is where Julian's cognitive architecture completely collapses. He points at his watch and says, "It's only 6.02.
No. He becomes the guy trying to bend the rules.
When the waiter reiterates the policy, Julian doesn't accept the boundary. Instead, he launches into this convoluted argument about customer-centric flexibility.
Wait, he's arguing for the exact same lack of operational discipline that he literally just told the CEO to stop doing.
He starts lecturing the waiter on the short-sightedness of rigid rules. It's wildly ironic. He perfectly understands the logic of the rule. He knows how time works.
So yeah, 6.02 is definitely after 6.0.
Right. And if he were sitting at the next table watching someone else do this, he would diagnose their irrational behavior instantly. But in the heat of his own hunger, the logic just becomes a foreign language.
It's like his own expertise is just completely inaccessible to him in that moment.
Exactly. And he knows it too. He feels that hot flash of shame when the waiter finally just stops arguing and points to the printed sign. Julian knows he's wrong, but he literally can't stop himself.
He's a victim of his own subjective inconvenience. Fascinating. Does psychology have a name for this specific type of breakdown?
It's a deeply ingrained cognitive blind spot called Solomon's paradox. And it completely dismantles our cultural assumption that if you're smart, you're universally rational.
Solomon's paradox. I'm assuming that comes from King Solomon.
Exactly. King Solomon was the third leader of the Jewish kingdom, and historically he was recognized globally as a paragon of wisdom.
Right, the guy people traveled across the world to see because he was so good at solving complex disputes.
He had this unparalleled ability to look at other people's chaotic emotional lives and prescribe flawlessly balanced, rational solutions. He was the ultimate objective observer.
But his own life was a mess, wasn't it?
Paradox. While he was managing all these foreign disputes with perfect clarity, his personal life was just a sequence of catastrophic, irrational decisions.
What kind of decisions?
Well, he amassed massive amounts of wealth driven entirely by unchecked ego. He maintained hundreds of wives and concubines, which created disastrous political instability.
Wow. Yeah, that's not exactly wise management.
And most notably, he completely neglected the instruction and discipline of his only son, Rehoboam.
And how did that turn out for the kingdom?
Horribly. His son grew up to be this incompetent, reactionary tyrant. His decisions directly led to the fracturing and the absolute demise of the kingdom that Solomon spent his whole life building.
So Solomon had all the blueprints for wise reasoning, but he couldn't apply them to his own house.
That's a great way to put it. We see this exact phenomenon replicated constantly today. Take the historical case of Chief Judge Solomon Wattler.
A judge. That seems like the ultimate test of objective reasoning.
He was a brilliant legal mind. He literally set the standard for legal protections against spousal abuse and advanced anti-discrimination law. On the bench, evaluating others, his logic was airtight.
He protected the vulnerable, but let me guess, not in his own life.
Right. When an emotional conflict came up involving his ex-mistress, all that legal architecture just vanished from his mind. He engaged in a sustained campaign of criminal harassment against her.
Seriously. The guy who wrote the laws protecting women from harassment did that.
Yes. He even threatened to kidnap her daughter. He went to prison for 11 months for committing the exact crimes he spent his career prosecuting.
The cognitive framework just collapses the second the self is involved.
It does. And to understand why, we have to look at the research from the University of Waterloo. They broke down what wise reasoning actually entails. It's not just a vague concept.
Okay, so what are the actual mechanics of wise reasoning?
They identified 4 distinct pillars. The first pillar is recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. It's basically intellectual humility.
So understanding that your immediate perception isn't necessarily the absolute truth.
Right. Think back to Julian at the bistro. He assumed his perspective, that 2 minutes shouldn't matter, was the only valid reality. He totally failed to recognize that the restaurant might have rigid kitchen ticketing systems he knew nothing about. Acknowledging other people's perspectives, you have to step outside your own sensory experience and model the reality of another person.
Which Julian also failed at. He just treated the waiter like a roadblock.
He couldn't model the waiter's perspective at all. The waiter was just trying to follow management's policy so he wouldn't get fired.
Right. The waiter isn't trying to ruin Julian's night. He's just doing his job. And the third pillar.
Recognizing that circumstances are in flux. Understanding that situations will unfold and change over time instead of being trapped in reactive, localized thinking.
So, like remembering that you won't be hungry forever.
When you're stuck in an egocentric viewpoint, the present moment feels infinite. Julia's immediate hunger felt like a world-ending crisis. He lost the perspective that in 20 minutes he'd be eating anyway.
He was just ruining his own evening. And the fourth pillar,
The ability to search for a compromise or reconcile opposing viewpoints.
which he didn't do. He wanted the restaurant to just bend its rules entirely for him.
In the boardroom earlier that day, Julian used all 4 pillars effortlessly. But the moment the problem shifted to his own dinner, his ego took over. The proximity to the self triggered a defensive override.
Are there specific studies that actually test this override?
Absolutely. There's a highly detailed experiment that looked at this exact asymmetry. Researchers gathered over 100 people who were in long-term romantic relationships.
Okay, testing romantic relationships sounds like a recipe for a lot of emotional volatility.
Which is exactly what they wanted. They designed an experiment to test logic in highly charged scenarios. They split the participants into 2 distinct groups.
How do they separate them?
The first group was given a prompt and told to vividly imagine that their own romantic partner had cheated on them. They had to visualize finding out, the immediate aftermath, everything.
Brutal. That immediately triggers the ego and the defense mechanism.
Exactly. Now, the second group got an almost identical prompt, but with a crucial shift. They were asked to imagine that their best friend's romantic partner had cheated on their friend.
So they still have to process the infidelity, but they are one step removed from the threat.
Right. Then, both groups were asked a series of questions about how the conflict should be handled and how the relationship would unfold. And their answers were scored strictly against those 4 pillars of wise reasoning.
I think I can guess where this is going, but what did the data show?
A massive, undeniable asymmetry. The participants evaluating their friend's hypothetical situation displayed significantly higher levels of wisdom across all 4 pillars.
They could actually be objective.
They asked for more context like, why did the cheating happen? They considered multiple future outcomes, they were open to compromise, and had measured emotional responses.
Because the threat wasn't aimed at them. They could see the whole board.
But the group evaluating their own hypothetical betrayal, they scored dismally. Their reasoning became incredibly rigid and completely egocentric.
That's if you imagine getting cheated on, you're not thinking about underlying issues, you're just angry.
Right. They processed it exclusively through a lens of self-preservation and distress. The emotional proximity shut down the higher-order processing in the prefrontal cortex. They didn't want context. They demanded retribution.
So they had the intellectual tools to reason through infidelity, but the ego basically put a padlock on the toolbox.
Now, usually we assume this kind of egocentric blindness is just a symptom of immaturity, right?
Totally. We assume you just grow out of it. Like age naturally cures that gap. You live longer, you see more, you get wiser.
That is a very comforting narrative, but the research proves it's dangerously flawed. To test that specific assumption, researchers expanded the experiment to compare different age demographics.
Okay, so they brought in older participants.
Yes. They had a cohort of younger adults aged 20 to 40 and a cohort of older adults aged 60 to 80. Both groups were presented with a deep, unexpected betrayal by a close friend or family member.
And let me guess, the older adults didn't actually do any better when it was personal.
It completely disrupts our traditional beliefs. Now, to be fair, when reasoning about abstract societal conflicts like foreign policy or economics, the older adults consistently outperform the younger ones.
Because they have decades of observation, they have distributional information.
Exactly. They understand the base rates of human behavior. They know political scandals usually blow over. They have a massive historical sample size to draw from.
But what happens when the scenario shifts back to the personal betrayal?
The older adults essentially discarded all that distributional knowledge. They threw out 60 years of data. When the conflict was case-based and personal, their cognitive advantage vanished entirely.
Oh, so they became just as trapped in the egocentric bias as the 20-somethings.
Statistically indistinguishable. When case-based personal information is present, the brain just prioritizes it over a lifetime of acquired wisdom. The subjective threat overrides the analytical circuits.
It's basically treating a personal insult like a literal survival threat.
Yeah.
It ignores the historical context completely. You know, if wisdom doesn't naturally accrue with age when it comes to personal matters, then this comprehension gap isn't a lapse in maturity, it's a mechanical flaw. It's a systemic override of our analytical brain.
That is the defining characteristic of a level 3 comprehension failure. The logic is perfectly understood, the vocabulary is known, but the subject automatically bypasses the logic when the subject is themselves.
The knowledge is intact, but the pathway to application is blocked by the ego.
Exactly. But the ego is only one type of blockade. What happens when the pathway is blocked not by emotions, but by a sheer mechanical failure to connect literal facts?
Right, moving from the emotional override to the mechanical failure. You called this level 1.
Yes, level 1. This is where someone possesses the literal data. They can read the words perfectly, but they completely lack the cognitive architecture to synthesize those words into physical reality.
So they can read, but they can't connect the dots. Give us a scenario for this one.
Let's shift from the London bistro to a highly structured industrial setting. Picture a fluorescent-lit community center on the outskirts of Detroit.
Okay, totally different vibe.
The room hums with this overworked ventilation system. It smells like stale coffee, and it's filled with adults taking a mandatory digital transition workshop for manufacturing employees.
So these are experienced workers trying to learn new automated systems.
Right. Sitting in the second row is Arthur. Arthur is 50. He's a former assembly line lead. Now, Arthur is not illiterate. His reading comprehension of the individual words in his training manual is completely flawless.
So if you asked him to read a paragraph out loud, he could do it.
With perfect diction. The manual states a clear conditional logic sequence. If the red indicator light flashes 3 times rapidly, immediately reset the primary circuit.
He knows what red means. He knows what a circuit is.
He possesses all the individual data points, but then the instructor runs a physical simulation. On the factory floor mock-up in the center of the room, a machine shutters. A bright red light on the control panel physically flashes 3 times.
And what does Arthur do?
He completely freezes. The if-then logic that is clearly printed on the page in his hands fails entirely to translate to the physical reality of the machine in front of him.
Oh man, the mechanical connection just isn't there.
It's broken. He stares at the page and he just sees the words as isolated islands of text. They're just shapes on paper. They don't form a map to the physical room.
That has to be incredibly stressful for him.
It's a crushing, silent panic. He starts believing his brain is just defective, that he's wired for a manual labor world that just doesn't exist anymore.
But he's not defective. It's a specific cognitive disconnection. He knows the literal definitions, but he's blind to the execution.
Exactly. And this mechanical failure bleeds into his everyday life, too. During the break, Arthur pulls out his wallet and sees a brightly colored coupon for a car wash.
Okay, kind of like the coupon example from the intro.
He realizes he tried to use this exact coupon twice at 2 completely wrong locations. Why? Because he liked the bright blue color of the paper and recognized the brand logo.
But he didn't read the address.
His brain processed visual aesthetics perfectly, but it never synthesized the bold, black printed address at the bottom of the slip. He saw the letters, but he never cognitively mapped them to physical streets in his actual city.
Wow. It's a quiet tragedy. He's an adult learner hiding behind a tough guy mask, completely trapped in the void between reading and operational thinking.
And Arthur is not an isolated incident. This is a massive systemic issue. When organizations like the OECD measure adult competencies with their PIAC survey, they consistently find millions of adults who fall into this exact gap.
Millions. Yeah. So we tend to think of literacy as a binary, like either you can read or you can't. But you're saying that's dangerously flawed.
Millions of adults can technically decode words. They can sound them out and define them in isolation. But they lack the functional capacity to extract that information and apply it to a complex task.
Because reading comprehension isn't just passive absorption.
No, it is a highly active, metabolically expensive cognitive process. To achieve functional literacy, adults have to employ very specific, active cognitive strategies. The first is summarizing, taking a dense paragraph and mentally chunking it down into a single concept. If you can't chunk it, it overloads your working memory immediately.
Well, there's only so much you can hold in your head at once.
The second strategy is drawing inferences. This is where Arthur fails. It's the ability to read between the lines and connect unstated facts to the environment.
So understanding that the abstract red light in the manual is the literal glass bulb flashing in front of you.
Yes. And the third is metacognitive self-questioning. It's an internal dialogue where you stop every few sentences and ask, does this actually make sense based on reality?
So Arthur has the decoding skills, but he entirely lacks these 3 active strategies. The bridge is never built. It feels like having all the raw materials dropped on an empty dirt lot to build a house. You've got the bricks, the timber, the nails. That's Arthur's vocabulary. He has all the materials.
But possessing the materials is totally useless if you have no architectural blueprint.
Right. The blueprints are those cognitive strategies, the inferencing, the summarizing.
Yeah.
Without them, the bricks just sit there. The concept of the red light remains isolated from the concept of the reset button. The logic is unassembled.
Unassembled, yes. And this inability to assemble the logic under pressure is deeply tied to cognitive strain. It explains why the brain just shuts down when asked to process too many novel inputs at once.
This is a biological limitation of the working memory.
Strictly limited and quantifiable. You can only hold so many variables in your mind. Think about Arthur's environment. He's in a stressful classroom. He's using massive mental energy, just masking his fear of looking foolish.
That alone eats up so much cognitive bandwidth.
Exactly. Plus, he's trying to decode a dense manual, learn a new physical interface, and listen to the instructor. The demands are overwhelming. He experiences catastrophic cognitive overload.
His brain literally runs out of processing power.
And when that hits zero, the higher order functions are sacrificed first. The brain abandons drawing inferences and just retreats to staring blankly at the isolated words.
Which is why you can't just tell someone like Arthur to read more carefully.
Telling him to read it again doesn't give him a blueprint. It just forces him to stare at the pile of bricks again.
Yeah. So we mapped out level 3, the emotional override of logic. And level 1, the mechanical failure of logic due to cognitive strain.
Right, which brings us to level 2.
Level 2, the analogical gap, the failure to transfer abstract concepts.
Yes. What happens when the breakdown isn't emotional, and it's not a failure to read a manual, but a total inability to process metaphorical value?
Like when you try to explain why something is valuable using an analogy, and the listener just takes it entirely literally.
Exactly. To explore this, let's step into a boutique textile studio in Milan.
Nice. From a Detroit factory to a Milan boutique.
It's bathed in natural light, floor-to-ceiling shelves holding the finest hand-loomed European wool. The owner is Clara. She's a master artisan.
So she really knows her craft.
She understands the microscopic details of thread counts and dye absorption. But because her work is so complex, analogies are her primary language. She relies on metaphors to bridge the gap for her customers.
She calls a scarf a second skin, stuff like that.
Right. But currently, Clara is facing an infuriating disconnect. An influencer walks in, live streaming on her phone, picks up a meticulously crafted wrap priced at 400 euros, and asks if it's basically the exact same thing as a 20 euro synthetic scarf from a fast fashion brand.
Just completely ignoring the craftsmanship.
The influencer only sees the surface utility. It's fabric for your neck. She is completely blind to the unseen value, the ethical sourcing, the decades of technique.
So Clara has to communicate that invisible abstract value. How does she do it?
She turns to her primary tool. She tries to explain the dyeing process by comparing the slow, meticulous fermentation of her organic dyes to the aging process of a fine vintage wine.
Both take time, specific conditions, expertise.
It's a great analogy conceptually, but as she speaks, the influencer's eyes just glaze over. The connection is entirely missed. To the influencer, a scarf is a physical commodity, not a concept. And it definitely has nothing to do with grapes.
The analogy just totally fails to land.
Clara assumes the customer possesses the same baseline logic of quality that she does. She assumes they share the blueprint. When she realizes they don't, she gets frustrated and snaps.
Okay.
She tells the influencer that demanding a massive discount on a hand-loomed piece of art is like asking a portrait painter to use less blue paint to save money on the commission.
Oh, wow. A desperate attempt to force the logic through a new analogy. Did it work?
The influencer reacts with unblinking confusion. She takes the statement entirely literally. She looks around the shop, sees no canvases, and leaves offended. She actually posts a review complaining about Clara's hostile attitude regarding blue paint.
That sounds absurd, but I've definitely seen interactions like that. It's a real-time breakdown of analogical thinking.
Cognitive psychologists from Buffalo State have studied this extensively. They highlight an inescapable truth. Humans are structurally incapable of understanding entirely new concepts in a vacuum.
We have to map new things onto things we already understand.
Yes. Analogical thinking is the engine of all complex learning. If you can't process an analogy, you can't learn an abstract concept. And building an analogy requires 4 sequential stages.
Okay, let's break down those stages.
Retrieval. The brain is presented with a new concept, the target, and scans long-term memory to retrieve a familiar domain. the source analog. Clara retrieved aging fine wine to explain her dyes.
Stage 2.
Mapping. The brain takes the source and aligns its structural relationships with the new target. You map the time required for wine to the time for dye, the vintner to the weaver.
And the third stage.
Inference. You project conclusions from the source onto the target. If aged wine is valuable, then fermented dye must be valuable.
Stage.
Evaluation. The brain assesses if the analogy holds up to logical scrutiny.
So where exactly did Clara's communication collapse?
At stage 2, mapping. Specifically, a failure in structure mapping. For an analogy to work, the listener must ignore the surface-level details and focus entirely on the underlying relational structure.
But the human brain is lazy, isn't it? We get caught up on the surface details.
Exactly. Clara was trying to map the relationship between time and value, but the influencer's working memory snagged on the surface attribute. She was probably thinking, we're talking about scarves, why is she talking about beverages?
The domains were visually too far apart for her brain to make the structural jump.
And the blue paint analogy suffered the exact same structural collapse. Clara wanted to map the relationship between compromising an essential component and destroying the final product.
You can't remove the labor and have the same scarf, just like you can't remove the blue paint and have the same painting.
But the customer just heard blue paint and processed it as a physical reality in the store instantly.
I mean, think about retail. If a customer asks about inventory at a competitor's store, and the clerk says, would you ask a mechanic to diagnose a car in a different garage?
Example. The clerk is structurally mapping the limits of knowledge, but the customer says, I'm asking about a TV, not a car. They take it literally.
This breakdown has to be a huge factor in broader business failures, especially in customer relationship management, right?
It is deeply destructive. Economic research on retail interactions, especially in developing Tier 3 markets, shows this clearly. Local shop owners will stock incredible, high-quality inventory.
They have the genuinely great food in the kitchen, like the restaurant analogy.
Right. But they consistently lose business because of these communication gaps. The sales staff are often hired for basic transactional duties and lack formal CRM training.
So when a customer asks about a complex product, the staff doesn't know how to communicate the abstract value.
Instead of guiding the customer, they panic. They jump straight to highly literal, inappropriate questions about price or budget. They abandon the abstract entirely.
If someone is looking at a high-end item, a trained salesperson would use, what, progressive alignment?
Yes. They start with simple, related comparisons to build a foundation, slowly bridging the gap to the abstract. But an untrained person just states the high price. And if the customer hesitates, they might literally question the customer's ability to afford it.
Which is universally offensive. And it drives customers straight to online platforms where the value is just sterile bullet points. No awkward human interaction required.
The physical store goes out of business simply because the staff couldn't map the analogy.
Here. Are we letting Clara off the hook too easily?
So,
is it possible that relying on these complex analogies is actually just a lazy shortcut for the communicator? I mean, if the influencer has never been to a vineyard and knows nothing about wine fermentation, the structure mapping fails before it even starts.
The cognitive burden cannot solely rest on the listener.
It's like trying to build a massive suspension bridge on a foundation of sand. The burden of communication has to adapt to the listener's actual baseline knowledge.
That is a perfectly valid critique. If the source analog isn't firmly established in the listener's working memory, the whole 4-stage process collapses at stage 1.
Clara chose an analogy that was totally foreign to the influencer. It was kind of an arrogant assumption of shared reality. We have to actively diagnose who we are speaking to.
But as we diagnose these issues, we also have to acknowledge a massive exception to all these cognitive failures.
Right, the aggressive coupon user from the intro.
There's a demographic that doesn't suffer from cognitive strain, doesn't fail to map analogies, and isn't blinded by personal ego, yet they still act completely disconnected from logic.
The person who walks in at 8:00 p.m. with the first 3 customers only coupon, they know what first 3 means. They know it's nighttime.
The literal facts have connected in their brain perfectly, but they push forward anyway. They escalate, demand a manager, cause a scene.
This isn't a level 1, 2, or 3 failure. This is deliberate.
It is a calculated, escalating behavioral strategy. Through repeated interactions, they've learned that in corporatized customer service, causing intense social friction often yields a managerial concession.
Just to make them go away. They're bypassing logic because ignoring it is economically advantageous for them.
It's behavioral manipulation, entirely distinct from a cognitive processing issue. And distinguishing this from genuine gaps is absolutely crucial for large organizations.
Because if you misdiagnose it, you apply the wrong solution and just make things worse.
If someone is using a deliberate strategy to extract concessions, the only effective intervention is the rigid enforcement of strict boundaries. Concessions just reinforce the bad behavior.
But if you assume an employee is being willfully difficult, when really they're suffering from Arthur's level 1 disconnect, rigid discipline will completely destroy them.
It destroys morale and productivity instantly. We need targeted interventions. And these cognitive gaps become incredibly destructive when scaled up in complex workplace environments.
What kind of systemic barriers exacerbate these gaps?
Researchers mapped the structural topography of workplace communication failure. They found that basic language and semantic barriers are just the tip of the iceberg.
Even if everyone speaks fluent English, right?
Yes. Variations in departmental vocabulary, technical jargon, corporate slang, they create massive zones of confusion. An engineer's definition of optimized might be structurally different from marketing's definition.
And then you layer psychological barriers on top of that.
Which fractures the system. Acute personal stress, underlying anger, or chronic anxiety physically alter the brain's neurochemistry. It restricts the working memory's ability to process new information.
Not to mention the fear of criticism. If Arthur doesn't want to look stupid in front of his manager, he's just going to nod his head and pretend he understands the blueprint.
Exactly. Furthermore, rigid, highly vertical hierarchies naturally distort conceptual information. When an abstract strategy passes down through middle management, the underlying value is often systematically stripped away.
It's a corporate game of telephone. The vision becomes just a list of literal directives, and the employees have no analogical understanding of why they're doing it.
And this distortion is compounded by a systemic lack of active listening skills and open feedback loops. Without a mechanism to confirm that the structure mapping was successful, like asking the employee to explain the strategy back, the organization operates on a dangerous delusion.
Management just assumes the message was internalized because the words were spoken in a meeting.
Which leads directly to interdepartmental conflicts, project delays, diminished trust, and unsustainable turnover rates. And the organization often can't detect it until the productivity metrics actually plummet.
By the time it's on a spreadsheet, the damage is already done. Okay, so we've mapped the failures, the cognitive strain, the collapse of analogies, the ego override.
The research provides highly specific, actionable interventions for each level. Let's start with level 3, Solomon's paradox. How do we bypass Julian's ego at the bistro?
Right. How do we get the logic back online?
The solution is a cognitive mechanism known as self-distancing. Experimental data proves you can actively trick your own brain out of its egocentric bias through a simple linguistic shift.
A linguistic shift.
When evaluating an emotional conflict, we naturally use first-person pronouns. Why is this happening to me? This anchors the processing in the ego, triggering the override.
But the research shows we can change that by changing the pronouns, right?
Yes. If you force the individual to replace I and me with third-person pronouns or their own proper name, the cognitive processing fundamentally changes.
So if Julian had paused and asked, why is Julian so upset about the early bird special? Instead of, why am I being denied?
Exactly. It mechanically forces his brain to process the event from the perspective of an external observer. It creates an artificial distance.
You literally force your brain to evaluate yourself like you're a stranger on the street.
And the experiment showed that participants who engaged in self-distancing reasoned just as wisely about their own severe problems as they did about a hypothetical stranger's. It completely eliminates the self-other asymmetry.
That is an incredibly powerful tool. You can use it in a marital argument or a boardroom negotiation. It's a biological hack to keep the prefrontal cortex online.
It actively restores objective wisdom. Now moving to level 2, the failure of analogies. The intervention here requires a structured approach called the Focus Action Reflection Framework, the FR framework.
Okay, break down the FR framework. This is what Clara needed in Milan.
Rather than throwing a complex analogy at a listener and blindly hoping it maps, you use progressive alignment. Step 1 is the focus phase.
So before you even introduce the analogy, you actively evaluate the listener's baseline knowledge.
You verify they actually possess a deep structural understanding of the source analog. If Claire had used the focus phase, she'd realize the influencer knew nothing about wine fermentation and abandoned that analogy immediately.
She could have asked, do you understand the labor in handmade leather goods? and found an analog rooted in the listener's reality.
Exactly. Once the baseline is established, you move to the action phase. You explicitly, deliberately map the structural relationships. You don't leave it to chance.
You literally draw the map for them. Just like a leather worker spends 20 hours treating a hide, I spend 20 hours fermenting this dye.
You actively guide their attention away from surface attributes and lock it onto the structural relationship. Finally, the reflection phase. You pause to check for understanding. You ask the listener to summarize the connection back to you.
You make the analogical transfer active and verifiable. Okay, what about level 1? What is the fix for Arthur, frozen on the factory floor?
The intervention for level 1 is metacognitive self-regulation. We can't just mandate that adults read more carefully. That just increases cognitive strain.
We have to teach them to be conscious observers of their own thinking.
We equip them with a specific toolbox of active reading strategies. We teach them how to physically summarize paragraphs to reduce the load on working memory. We teach them to write unstated inferences in the margins.
More importantly, evaluating if the strategy is actually working real time, right?
Yes. If Arthur is reading top to bottom and it's not translating to the machine, he needs the metacognitive awareness to recognize the failure. He needs to recognize the feeling of cognitive overload, stop, abandon the strategy, and switch tools.
Like drawing a physical diagram to visually map the text to the actual buttons, moving from passive decoding to active construction.
Finally, addressing the systemic retail and business gaps requires organizational restructuring. Formal CRM training is an absolute necessity.
Sales staff have to be trained to move beyond literal transactional questions.
They need clear, concise language devoid of assumed metaphors that might alienate a diverse customer base. Above all, businesses must mandate a genuinely customer-centric communication architecture.
So shifting the goal of the initial interaction. It's no longer about pitching the abstract value immediately.
The goal is to actively listen, to uncover the consumer's baseline knowledge and literal needs before attempting to build the bridge to abstract value.
Open feedback loops. Synthesizing all this data from psychology to adult literacy to retail economics, the overarching solution is really the same across the board.
It is identical across all environments. Whether it's Julian in London, Arthur in Detroit, or Clara in Milan, it demands the exact same fundamental shift in human behavior.
We have to step outside of our own automatic, deeply entrenched assumptions. We have to take the invisible structures of our logic and make them undeniably clear.
We have to abandon the arrogant assumption that just because we have the perfect blueprint in our minds, everyone else can magically see the finished house.
They can't see the house. They only see the bricks. We have to be willing to sit down in the dirt and draw out the blueprint together, line by tedious line.
Whether that means utilizing linguistic self-distancing, progressively mapping an analogy, or consciously monitoring our own cognitive load.
The journey from recognizing a literal word to following its meaning to a physical behavioral conclusion, it's not a straight line. It's a vast, invisible cognitive terrain full of mechanical failures.
These aren't rare glitches in defective minds. The inability to translate text into behavior, the failure to map analogies, the ego's emotional roadblock, these govern the processing power of absolutely everyone, regardless of education or status.
But the barrier between possessing value and communicating it isn't a fixed concrete wall. By employing self-distancing, metacognitive regulation, and structured mapping, that gap can absolutely be bridged. It takes intense effort and intellectual humility. You have to accept that simply sharing a common language never guarantees sharing a common reality. The value is there. It just takes the deliberate work of building the bridge. That really is the only way the quality in the kitchen ever reaches the street.